aboard. I mean, you can see how popular you are, or that this whole concern is that we've crossed 100 here, which is a lot in a lot of ways, because online at night, I've just reached back home and joined. So welcome aboard. And we'll have Britain. Have you introduced, ma'am, or how are we doing this very quickly?
Ma'am, now can you please deliver the welcome address?
Okay, so basically, I mean, it's a whole array of, a domain that she's going to speak about, gendered spaces, in which spaces and gender as a feminist concept is huge. And gender spaces are areas where particular genders of people and particular types of gender expression are considered welcome or appropriate, and other types unwelcome. Or inappropriate. So gendering of spaces is an important means by which social systems maintain organization of gender. So Professor Cooke is going to focus on something particular, but gender geography also speaks about oppression of women and inequalities that are found in their treatment, spaces and place, basically, mediate gendered norms and practices through a complex interplay of social structures and institutions. And this, of course, impacts women's lives in terms of how they are played out in different contexts. So gendered geographies, which is what she's looking at, foreground this, how gendered roles and practices intersect with concepts of space and place. So drawing upon cases across regions, and Professor Cooke is going to draw on the Middle East, we are looking at really interrogating this kind of convergence to explore how it reproduces traditional kind of hierarchies of power and privileges in a society. So this can be done by examining everyday lives of women vis-a-vis issues, say, of national, transnational identities, gendered struggles in livelihoods, and the kind of negotiation and contestations adopted by women. So reflections of recent spatial turn in social sciences is a kind of a paradigm shift, which has helped us to reclaim this kind of a explanatory power of space and place in social theory. So in doing so, what we're really questioning is the conventional definition of space as being absolute. So, and women's roles in this conflict and cultural identities are very, very complex and have a whole array of meaning in terms of being gatekeepers of, say, culture. They're supposed to be primary transmitters of culture to the next generation, and therefore important for conflict and, kind of a democratic transition. Also, as victims of ethnic conflict, women are most often affected by ethnic conflicts, experiencing abduction, violence of different sort, forced marriages. Alongside with being the custodians of culture, so to say, they're also most often victims of any kind of ethnic conflict. So that becomes another. Also, users of tacit kind of knowledge systems that we have. They're affected by inequalities, affected by gender-based violence, affected by role conflict and expectation, basically the role expectation in the spaces that they occupy. So welcome aboard, Professor Miriam Cooke. And you're going to look at the Middle East, and we're all waiting eagerly for you to put that in perspective. And this is definitely a very significant area, because even when we talk about spaces as a feminist concept, in terms of not just personal, political, professional, geographical, but in other ways too. And that is something which we need to highlight and show how they're so unequal and so inaccessible in a lot of times, affected by a whole array of factors. So without much ado, I'd like to welcome you to, present before us your analysis. And thank you for being here before anything else. And apologies for the, kind of delay because of technical glitches.
Thank you very much.
Are we able to make the presentation or not?
Yes, I have the presentation. And Briti, can we just continue?
Yes, ma'am. So before we proceed into the session, I would like to tell the audience that the floor, it is going to be quite interactive. So the audience can post their questions on the chat box. And it is requested that you keep your questions short and brief. So now I would like Rupangshi from first semester to introduce our speaker, Professor Miriam Cooke. Over to you.
Yeah. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, Manshi, you are.
Good evening. It is both a privilege and a pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker today, Professor Miriam Cooke. This occasion offers us a unique opportunity to engage with critical topics at the intersection of gender, conflict, and cultural studies. As students and scholars of history, anthropology, and gender studies, many of us are well acquainted with Professor Cooke's name and contributions. For those who may not yet be familiar with her impressive body of work, allow me to provide a brief introduction. Professor Miriam Cooke has served the field of Arab studies as a distinguished author, translator, editor, and teacher. After earning her TEFL from Oxford University, she joined the faculty of Duke University in the United States as the Braxten Craven Professor in the year 1980. Her academic influence extends globally, having served as a visiting professor in Tunisia, Romania, Indonesia, Qatar, and Istanbul. Beyond her teaching, Professor Cooke plays a pivotal role in shaping international academic discourse through her service on numerous advisory boards of journals and institutions. Her research spans a wide array of critical subjects, including the intersection of gender and war in modern Arabic literature, the contributions of Arab women writers to Islamic feminism, and global Muslim networks. Her scholarship has significantly shaped how we understand the narratives and agency of women in these complex contexts. Professor Cooke has authored a number of influential monographs and has co-edited the Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, each of which has left a lasting imprint on fields of cultural and gender studies. Among her many works are The Anatomy of an Egyptian Intellectual, Yahya Haki in 1984, Women and the War Story, 1997, Women Claiming Islam, Creating Islamic Feminism Through Literature, 2001, and Dissident Syria, Meeting Oppositional Arts Official, 2010. These works are as compelling in content as the title suggests, offering profound insights into their subjects. Today's event is about more than an academic inquiry. It is an opportunity to reflect, learn, and engage with the diverse and resilient voices of Arab women, voices that Professor Cooke has brought to the forefront of scholarship with unwavering dedication. It is with great respect and gratitude that we welcome Professor Cooke to speak with us today. Without further ado, I'm honored to hand over the floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these wonderful introductions. Let me just, since we're talking about technical things, there are many hands floating across the screen. Is there a reason for that?
I think they're more like appreciating the whole context. I don't think they're saying anything at this point. You'll have raised hands.
Yeah.
So, yes. So please just ignore that for the time being.
Okay. Well, it's a delight to be with you. The only thing that would be better would be to be with you. When my husband Bruce Lawrence and I were in Delhi 5 years ago, we were at your university and had some wonderful encounters there. But at that point, I think I didn't know Professor Amina Hussain. So this is a new opportunity, and I want to thank you all for this very kind invitation. So let's open up the PowerPoint. Let's hope it's working. If not, we'll find a way of doing it.
It's working.
I see nothing.
Oh, you don't see? It's coming on. The presentation is coming on.
It's being shared.
Wonderful. So I guess what I'll do is I'll put my hand up when I want to go, when I would appreciate it being moved to the next screen so that there isn't too much interruption. Okay? Okay. Does that work? Doesn't work. Can I have the next screen?
Your presentation will move as and when you ask for it to be. So,
I'd like to just put my hand up so that I don't constantly interrupt the flow of the talk.
All right. I hope you're making note of it. So just make a note of when she raises her hand, which means we are going to move the slide.
You can say next slide also. That's fine.
Okay. Next slide. Okay. Next slide.
We are on the first slide already. Arab feminist political thought. Yeah.
Good. Well, good evening to you. And today I'm going to be talking mostly about something a little different from what Professor Bulbul was talking about. What is similar is space. And what has always concerned me in my studies of women and the way in which they have written about their wars in the Arab world is space. Space has been crucial to my understanding of women's experiences of war. Now, the women that I'm interested in are feminists. So in other words, it is not so much a list of harms that have been done to women, but more a list of the ways in which women have seen themselves discriminated against and have said no to it, and with varying outcomes. So to introduce this discussion, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I call Arab feminist political thought. So in some ways, a kind of ideological background foundation to the way in which Arab women write about war. So like all feminisms, Arab feminist political thought is concerned with injustice, not only to women, but also to men. And I think that this is crucial because there has been, and it was for me when I was studying in England, feminism was always about empowered women and they hated men. And I would say that in general, Arab feminist political thought is not anti-men. And in many cases, and this is an entirely different talk, but in many cases, it is the way in which Arab feminists recognize that the patriarchal norms within which men function are very harmful to them. And being harmful to men are harmful to women and to society as a whole. So when I'm talking about Arab feminism, I'm talking about 22 countries. And in each case, each country is going to have, and each place and each person is going to have a specific agenda to deal with. And above all, and I will keep coming back to this, Arab feminist political thought calls for resistance to injustice. So that's the part I'm interested in. I'm interested in agency, in active participation in society. And above all, Arab feminism is not Western feminism, as is true anywhere outside the Euro-American sphere. I think that is an important point that needs to be made because Western feminism is concerned with issues that are specific to Euro-America. Next slide. So when we're talking about war stories, and I'm going to take you through 1,500 years, if that's okay, in half an hour, that there has been a huge shift over the past 30 years. But in general, there was the notion that experience gives you authority. And then the question is, who's talking about an experience that they're said to have had or could not have had? So originally, the war story was written by men, and it was a place where women were not. As Cynthia Enloe has written persuasively, and I gather that she's already spoken to you, she has this wonderful phrase, the front, the war front, is where women are not. So it's always going to be defined away from where women are. So one of my favorite war writers, a man, is Tim O'Brien, who says that the war stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, for men and women. Stories are for eternity when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. And that I think is the hope that's invested by many Arab women who have lived through wars. And as you know, the Arab world has been torn apart by wars since colonialism. So, you know, if you like, we can take it back to 1830 when the French colonized Algeria. But war has been pretty much a part of daily life. And so what happened over the past 30 years that I was just talking about now is with the emergence of postmodernism and the agenda of postmodernist theory to be a challenge to meta-narratives. Something radical has changed. And of course, the meta-narrative that interests me now is the war story. Next slide. So, history, and now I'm talking about Islamic history, but also Arab history. So from the time of Muhammad, and I will take it from the Hijra, so 622, women were involved in the Arab wars. So we have the Battle of Uhud in 625, when Nusayba bin Ka'b was very instrumental in the war, defending Muhammad, and he actually credits her in several places. So in Hadith, we have the report of him thanking Nusayba, but also others for having supported him. She, for a long time, was disappeared, of course, from history. And then we have Zainab, right? So Zainab, his granddaughter, Muhammad's granddaughter Fatima, and Ali's daughter, who was very involved in Karbala in Iraq in 680. And that in itself is a whole story. But again, this is a story that has been fairly recently recuperated as part of this postmodernist project to question what a war story is and why it is that it always marginalizes women. And I thought it was important to quote from Shafi'i, one of the founders of one of the four Sunni madhabs, where he writes, jihad, and of course, in everything that I'm writing, that I'm going to be talking about today, I'm going to be talking about forms of jihad, right? So for your audience, I don't have to talk about the differences between the jihad akbar, the greater jihad, which is with your soul, with yourself, and the lesser jihad, which is fighting with arms. But in this statement, but also in the Quran, jihad and rising up in arms in particular is obligatory for all able-bodied believers, exempting no one. So jihad, like prayer, pilgrimage, and zakat, no one is exempt from it. And this is part of the Arab feminist discourse that goes back to these original texts and says, well, women are Muslims, they're believers. And so they are not exempt from any of these obligations. Jihad is an obligation if the society in which the women live and function is under threat. Next slide. So what I want to do today is beyond, sort of setting up the erasure of early women in Islamic history, Arab Islamic history, is to look at the 20th and the 21st century. And I'm going to look in particular at three key moments. But before I do, there are two that I wanted to highlight. And so I wanted to highlight what was happening in Egypt. In 1919, so as you know, this is just a year after World War I, there was a demonstration by Egyptian women. They wanted to have Egypt represented by its own people at the Versailles Conference. And while the men were away, the women were demonstrating for Egyptian independence from the British. The British also in Palestine early after, so 1920, and women again were at the forefront of demonstrations against the British. But what I want to talk about in more detail today are three key moments. So the first is Algeria. So the revolution, the struggle for independence, 1954 to 62, that became emblematic for the African Revolution. So after 1962, when the Algerians pushed the French out, their revolution became emblematic of African revolutions against the French, the British, and the Belgians. And then Palestine, 1967 to 87. And then finally, I will spend a little bit of time on the Arab Spring so that we can think a little bit about the period that we're living in right now. Next slide.
Amina, next slide, Amina.
Yeah, thank you. So the first one I want to talk about is the Algerian Revolution. And it's interesting that the way women were represented during the war itself was romanticized by men, two men in particular. So one, of course, is France Fanon, the Martinican who actually went to Algeria and witnessed the revolution, and who was so struck by the way in which women were able to get into French spaces, not only in Algiers, the city, the Kasbah actually, but also in the Maquis. So the Maquis was up in the mountains. And he was so struck by their effectiveness that he claimed in his writings that the Algerian Revolution was won by women because of something he called stratégie femme, so woman strategy. And so it was clear later in just 1967 when Pontecorvo, the Italian filmmaker, went to Algiers, to the Kasbah, and filmed the Battle of Algiers. And in it, again, huge romanticization of women's roles. And it was close enough to the revolution that it clearly was based in fact. So the image that I have for you here comes from the film, and it's the moment when the women, including an older woman, decide that they are going to dress like French women. They're going to cut their hair. They're not going to wear a hijab or any form of Islamic dress, and they are going to penetrate into the French spaces. And of course, that's where one of these, this one, actually carries bombs into a cafe where the French are having a good time, even though it's right in the middle of the war, and they're oblivious because they are sure that they are not going to be defeated, and she plants her bomb there. So next slide, please. So it's interesting that what had happened after Pontecorvo's film. When I was in Algiers, I went to the Kasbah. It's been turned into a kind of Disney of the Battle of Algiers. It is places have the scenes from the film. This is where Pontecorvo filmed this part of the battle. So I mention this because even though we have all of this documentation of women's participation, after the revolution was declared won and over, something happened that has been called neo-traditionalism. And that is, it was not traditional for women to be at home. It was not traditional for women not to be educated. But it was a myth that was made up afterwards. Women were originally at home, they were mothers, they were wives, they were not active, certainly not in spaces where they would be close to men. And so we have this notion of, okay, the war's over, which is not specific just to Algeria. This is something that one sees across the world, that women can participate, as in World War II, Rosie the Riveter, they can participate during the war, but afterwards they have to go back home, even if they never were really homekeepers. And so women were disappeared. They were not in the new constitution, and I want you to remember this for what happened during what I'm going to talk about happened during the Arab Spring. There was nothing about women's rights, new rights in the Constitution. And what became clear was that women had so assumed that their active roles that had been so lionized were going to be recognized. They were going to be given rights that they assumed they would be given. You know, we were active, we contributed. In fact, without us, you would not have won. But they were disappeared. And Asia Jabar, very important Algerian woman writer, documents the way in which women were excluded in a collection of short stories called Women of Algiers in Their Apartment. And in one of the stories, she talks about some of the major combatants who are now living in a community up in the mountains, totally neglected. And she also makes a film about it. So the point that she made that was then picked up by Palestinian women, next slide, please, is that you have to record your participation. Because what happened in Algeria was that not only these two foreign men, so a Martinican and an Italian, were in awe of the women, but there were also Algerian men like Melek Haddad, who were writing, and Hamadib, who were writing about women's participation in a way that indicated they were absolutely terrified of them. Hamadib even talks about women combatants being like Medusa. So, you know, their hair turns into snakes, and if you look at these women, you'll turn into stone. So there was a lot going on in men's representations of women's writing, in women's contributions to the revolution, the women did not write about. And so when she writes Women of Algiers in Their Apartment, she's writing, this book doesn't come out till 1980, so it's 18 years afterwards. And she indicates there, we have to write. So what happens is in the Palestinian situation, so we have, of course, 1967, the June War of 1967, where the fairly newly established Israeli state pushes to the West Bank. And again, we have the displacement of more Palestinians from what used to be the land of Palestine. And so 1967 is 5 years after the Algerian war is over, when people are already calling about the marginalization of Algerian women an Algerian lesson. You cannot allow that to happen again. So what's interesting is the way in which Palestinian women like Fadwa Tuqan and Sahar Khalifa, both from Nablus, were writing almost immediately. 1968, 1969, they're writing about the ways in which women and children were able to keep Israeli tanks, Israeli soldiers off their streets. And so we have this record in novels and poetry, but the way it worked was the role of the international media. Because between 1967 and 1987, and Edward Said writes about that, there is a focus by international media on the role of unarmed Palestinian women against armed Israeli soldiers. And there emerged out of this confrontation, and I hope you can see the image, this was so typical. There emerged a genre of literature in Israeli literature, and it was called Shoot and Cry. And the Shoot and Cry was one of the stories, and it was acted out on stage. A soldier comes home and he falls into his mother's arms and he says, "Oh my God, I had to shoot this Palestinian woman and she was unarmed." And so his mother comforts him because, he had to shoot. And the shooting had become part of the international representation of the confrontation in the West Bank. Next slide. So I have called this period between 1967 and 1987, I've called it the Women's Intifada. So Intifada became a term that, in fact, has been used across the world, interestingly enough, for something between uprising and a revolution, sort of the people's unarmed rising up against injustice and cruelty by a dominant power. So here you have this image that was fairly typical at the time. And so in my book, Women in the War Story, that was mentioned in the introduction, I indicate that, in fact, 1987 is the end of the real Intifada, because it was the women's Intifada. They were the ones who were throwing the stones, they were burning the tires, they were sending kids out. There were no young men between 67 and 87 in the streets of the West Bank. But after 87, men took over that kind of what was supposed to be unarmed resistance, but they made the mistake of dressing in a particular way. So the keffiyeh that we're so familiar with now became almost like a uniform, and they were throwing Molotov cocktails. And so it was no longer taboo to attack these resistors. They looked like soldiers. They may not have had fancy weapons, but they certainly had weapons. And so that's where I see the end of the Intifada. But in history books, it's the beginning of the Intifada. Next slide, please. So I want to move now straight to the Arab Spring, because what I've seen in pretty much from the 7th century until today, we can see again in the Arab Spring, but maybe a little differently. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at what happened really over the last 13 years. So we have what I consider to be not so much the culmination, but a next step in Arab women's participation in their resistance to behavior treatment that is unjust to their people. It was remarkable, and I won't go into the history very much, but remarkable how quickly the revolution, the Arab Spring, which internally was referred to as revolution, how rapidly these revolutions just rolled across the Arab world. So started in Tunisia in December of 2010, went to Egypt, went to Algeria, went to Bahrain, went to Egypt, went to Syria. So it was a massive movement by people against dictators, because most of these countries were ruled by dictators. And in what follows and what I'm going to say, what I want to emphasize is that women were demanding karama. Karama is dignity. So this term karama that actually gave the many people titles to movements, to organizations. Dignity involves removing unjust rulers and respect for people's rights. Next slide. So the trajectory that I saw and I'm still seeing is everywhere, beginning with euphoria, absolute excitement, leading in some cases to backlash. But in all cases, and this is what is, I think, occluded in the ways in which we are looking at the trajectory of the Arab revolutions, is persistence. So in all cases, those who were participating in 2010, 11, 12, 13 still call what happened in the beginning. They're still calling it a revolution. In Syria, there is a website that daily records what art, stories, banners that are still part of this movement 13 years later, and they call it revolution. Next slide. So I'm going to start with the most successful, the most positive, and this is what was called Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution, which, as I said, started in 2010. Story of a young man, a vegetable vendor, who is insulted by a policewoman and who burns himself alive. And this started a revolution that took off in a way that, again, interestingly, sort of like Palestine, was covered by Al Jazeera. So Al Jazeera, the Qatari TV network, happened to be there, was able to get there very quickly to cover it. And so we can see that was how this movement across the Arab world happened. It happened in a village in a remote part of Tunisia, but Jazeera caught it, and it started this pan-Arab movement. Now, I think it's important to talk just very briefly about Tunisia and the difference. And that is that in 1956, when the Tunisians expelled the French as the they were the first, and then the Moroccans expelled the French. The person who came to power in Tunisia was Bourguiba. And in 1956, he made sure that the new laws were going to acknowledge women's roles in the expulsion of the French. So a very different situation there. So straight away, women were given extraordinary rights. They were given rights to not have a second wife. That was considered to be an injustice to women. And he also, among many other pro-women legislations, made sure that the practice of talaq, so men only initiated divorce, would no longer be possible. That divorce had to be something that was agreed upon by both the husband and the wife. Another thing that one man, a father, could not hand over his daughter to another man, that there had to be consent from both. So you get a sense of a very progressive Tunisian state, and there emerged in it over the years something that has been referred to as state feminism. State-sponsored feminism. In other words, organizations that supported women. The grassroots feminists were sort of opposed to it, but I think the presence of state-sponsored feminism made the results in Tunisia positive. Next slide, please. So you see here the image of women. So in 2014, so 3 years after the revolution broke out, we see a constitution unlike any other in the other Arab countries that were part of what was called the Arab Spring. So they had a parity clause in 2014. So all elected bodies should include at least 50% women. Now, it's been hard to maintain that, but at least it's in the Constitution. And they had a comprehensive law against gender-based violence, a huge issue across not only the Arab world, but of course across the world, that violence against women, CEDAW, of course, was criminalized. And fairly recently, in 2018, there has been a lot of discussion around equal inheritance. So, as I'm sure you know, being an Islamic university, that inheritance, women inherit half. And what they're still discussing, it's still being debated, is that this should no longer be the case. Women are equal to men. Okay, so no going back, as you can see in the image. Next slide. So the Egyptian case is an interesting one, not as positive in its outcome as Tunisia. So this young woman, Asma Mahfouz, was credited with being the one to really get the Tahrir revolution off the ground. So this image of hers that has become iconic is her Facebook, where she calls men to Tahrir. And it's interesting, the term that was used was remasculinize. So look, you've been under, Mubarak, and you as men have lost your masculinity. And the way you can get it back is to go to Tahrir and to make sure that we get rid of the tyrant. So in the same way that the Tunisians got rid of Zain al-Abidin very shortly after the revolution broke out there, so she calls men to Tahrir. And Tahrir is a mob scene. Next slide, please. And it was not only Asma Mahfouz, but it was very much a revolution in the beginning where women played important roles. Interestingly, it was almost set up, Tahrir, at that big square in the center of Cairo, was almost set up like an encampment or a number of encampments. And women were with men guarding entrance. So making sure that people weren't coming in with arms, making sure that people who wanted to be there were with them and safe. And for a while, and here you have a picture of Nawal Saadawi, the most prominent Arab feminist of the 20th century. She went there totally elated. And she said to me that the Muslim Brothers, the Ikhwan, who had put her on a death list in 1993, which is why I brought it to Duke for 4 years, that there were young Ikhwan, young Muslim Brothers, who welcomed her as a heroine. You and your feminist activism over the past 40, 50 years have enabled us to throw Mubarak out. Next slide. So she's the one in the middle there. So what happened very soon, 2011, 12, 13, we had the representation of women warriors during the Egyptian revolution of 2011. And here, this is a rather beautiful graffiti made by Ala Awad, an artist, art professor in Luxor in Upper Egypt. Here, he's got them as warriors, dressed as women, but as warriors. The next slide. And here's another. There was a movement called Women on Walls, which was actually WOW, W-O-W, WOW, covered walls with graffiti. And it was of the Isikhaita, so the Egyptian heroines of the revolution. So you can see that we have a recognition of women's important roles. Next slide. And then we have the backlash. And this happened very, very soon afterwards. So in the beginning, we have, women lionized, they're warriors, there are heroines, they're the ones who have kicked out the dictator. But then very soon, there's the backlash, which didn't happen in Tunisia to anything like the same extent. And so the image that I have on the screen is مش هننسى يا ست البنات. We won't forget, young lady. And so here we have the thugs, and that was a technical term that was used for the guys who were out in the streets, harassing women. They were bringing them, they would surround them. There were some rapes, public rapes.